Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Winbridge Afterlife Science Podcast. I'm Aaliyah, and joining me as always is Anna. Hey, Anna.
Hey, Aaliyah. Hey, everyone. I'm excited about today's episode. It's one of my favorite topics in afterlife research.
Me too. So, today we're talking about something called the continuing bonds perspective, which is really important in understanding grief and how people cope with loss. Anna, you've done a lot of work in this area, haven't you?
Yes, absolutely. But before we start, I want to remind everyone that this podcast is for educational purposes only, and that you should always check with a healthcare provider when evaluating treatment options. With that said, the continuing bonds perspective is a game changer when it comes to how we think about grief. Traditionally, people were encouraged to move on after the loss of a loved one, but this perspective offers something very different.
Right. So instead of moving on, continuing bonds encourages people to maintain a connection with their deceased loved ones, correct?
Exactly. It's about transforming that relationship, not ending it. You might no longer interact with them physically, but you still carry them with you emotionally and spiritually. It's a more natural, compassionate way to process grief. Instead of feeling pressured to let go, you're allowed to maintain that connection.
That's such a beautiful way to look at it. So, how does this connect to what we do at Winbridge, especially when we talk about assisted after death communication through mediums?
Great question. In a lot of ways, the phenomenon of assisted after death communication, or assisted ADC, getting a reading from a medium, is an extension of this idea of continuing bonds. Many people seek out mediums to reconnect with loved ones who have passed. Through a mediumship reading, they're able to get messages or signs that reaffirm their ongoing bond. It's a way for people to continue that relationship, even though their loved one is no longer physically present.
That's so fascinating. It's like they're still part of your life, even if you can't see or touch them anymore. I imagine that must be incredibly comforting for people.
It really is. And in fact, we've seen through our research that many people report feeling a huge sense of relief and even joy after receiving messages from a medium. They feel reassured that their loved one is still with them in some way. It's a validation of that continuing bond.
I can totally see how that would work. But what makes this different from traditional grief counseling?
Traditional grief counseling, especially older models, focused on helping people detach from the deceased. The idea was to accept the loss and move forward. While that works for some people, it doesn't account for the fact that many people naturally continue to feel a connection to their loved ones after death. The continuing bonds perspective is much more flexible. It recognizes that it's okay to keep that connection as long as it's helpful for the person. It's a model that honors the enduring relationship people have with the deceased.
I love that it's not one size fits all. Some people really struggle with the idea of moving on, like they're being asked to forget their loved one. Continuing bonds seems much more compassionate.
Exactly. The idea that we should cut ties with our loved ones after they pass can feel counterintuitive for a lot of people. Continuing bonds allows for healing without that sense of finality. In fact, people who engage in assisted ADCs often feel that their bond with the deceased actually strengthens over time. It becomes a source of comfort rather than something they have to get over.
That's really powerful. So let's talk a little more about assisted ADCs. How does this fit into the larger grief process for people? Like, does everyone benefit from it the same way?
That's a great point. Not everyone has the same experience, and that's okay. Some people might feel a deep connection after a reading with a medium, while others might not feel as much. It's highly personal, and it depends on the individual's relationship with their loved one and where they are in their grief journey. But for many people, it can be a transformative experience. Our research shows that some participants report a significant reduction in grief after a mediumship reading. They feel like they've reconnected with their loved one, and that connection helps them move forward.
You know, I've heard that a lot of people who haven't experienced a mediumship reading might be skeptical. What would you say to them?
Skepticism is totally understandable. We live in a world where we're taught to question things we can't see or measure. But I think it's important to remember that whether or not you believe in the literal communication with the deceased, the experience itself can be incredibly meaningful for those who do. The messages people receive from mediums often validate their feelings of connection. and that in turn helps them heal. The focus is really on the therapeutic impact. Does it help people feel better? Does it help them cope with their grief? For many, the answer is yes.
Right. It's about the emotional benefit, not necessarily proving if it's real or not. That's an important distinction. Can you tell us more about the kinds of things people hear during these mediumship sessions? What kind of messages do they get?
Sure. Typically, messages fall into three categories. First, there's validation. Things like physical descriptions of the deceased, their personality, or memories that confirm to the sitter that the medium is really connecting with their loved one. Second, there's observation. The medium might share things about what the deceased has seen since they passed, like a wedding or birth. That reassures the sitter that their loved one is still present in some way. Finally, there are messages of comfort. Things like, I love you, or I'm okay. Sometimes they include advice or encouragement for the sitter, like, it's time to move forward, or I'm proud of you.
That sounds like such an emotional experience for people. It's like their loved one is still guiding them, even from beyond.
Yes, it can be incredibly moving. And this is where the continuing bonds perspective really shines. It reinforces that just because someone has passed, it doesn't mean they're gone from your life. They're still part of your journey. They're still offering support, love, and guidance, even if it's in a different way.
This makes me wonder about how these experiences compare to more spontaneous experiences of after death communication. Like, if someone just feels their loved one's presence or has a dream about them, how does that fit into continuing bonds?
That's a great question. Spontaneous ADCs, like feeling a presence or having a vivid dream, are also part of this idea of continuing bonds. In fact, these kinds of experiences are pretty common. Studies show that around a third of people who are grieving report some form of spontaneous after death communication. These experiences, whether spontaneous or assisted, allow the bereaved to feel that their loved one is still with them. They're different ways of accessing the same connection.
Wow, that's a lot higher than I expected. It just goes to show how natural these experiences are, and yet we don't talk about them enough.
Exactly. For a long time, there was a stigma around these kinds of experiences. People might have been afraid to share them out of fear of being labeled as irrational or overly emotional. But now, with the continuing bonds framework, there's a much more accepting attitude toward these experiences. They're seen as a natural part of grieving.
I really love how this perspective helps normalize those feelings and experiences. It gives people permission to grieve in a way that feels right for them.
Yes, and that's the key. Grief is so personal. Everyone processes it differently. The continuing bonds perspective gives people the space to maintain that connection with their loved ones and find comfort in it without feeling pressured to move on.
Before we wrap up, what would you say to someone who's considering going to a medium but might be hesitant?
I would say if you feel drawn to it, it's worth exploring. Everyone's experience is unique, and it might offer you some comfort or clarity in your grief. But like any tool, it works best when it's part of a broader support system. Combining it with other forms of therapy or support, like counseling, can make it even more effective. And if it's not something you're comfortable with, that's okay too. The most important thing is finding what helps you heal.
Such great advice, Anna. Thank you so much for diving into this topic with us today. I feel like we've really unpacked a lot about how the continuing bonds perspective can reshape the way we think about grief and mediumship.
Thanks, Aaliyah. It's always a pleasure to talk about these topics. I hope our listeners found it helpful and that they feel encouraged to approach grief in whatever way feels right for them.
And that's it for today's episode, folks. If you want to learn more about the continuing bonds perspective or assisted after death communication, head over to our website at winbridge.org. You can also join our email list, and if you find this free content helpful, please consider supporting our work. You can also learn more about this episode at afterlifescience.org. There, you'll find show notes, discussion questions, and other resources. Finally, remember to like and subscribe. You can find us on Amazon Music, Spotify, and other popular podcast sites. Okay, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time on the Winbridge Afterlife Science Podcast.
Take care, everyone.